Okay, so for our last topic, we're gonna go a little bit more further with the decals aspect of production. So we already went over Unreal Engine's built-in system, how they handle it with these volume-based cubes. Naturally, in games, there is another way of handling decals. It's in a sense, it's basically taking either the bump mapping or the parallax occlusion, depending on what you're allowed for your production for performance. But in general, it's just using flat geometry, very simple geometry. Like this one, I have shaped in a custom way so that there's not a lot of opacity showing. Because in a lot of cases, when you're handling like opacity and transparency, um, the areas that are overlapped in a sense, especially with like blendable transparency to like a ground plane, naturally will have but it's what they call quad overdraw. So like sometimes if you have like multiple ones of these types of planes that have like a decal on it, it naturally has that issue of like trying to figure out where one begins and one ends. So like when you're handling things like with opacity, especially like if you have a ton of these, or like next week we're gonna go over foliage. You don't want to have your foliage have all this extra space that's just not rendered because it just, even though it's not being visibly rendered, it's still showing up within the mesh, and those parts have this type of overlapping issue that you would have a problem with. Um, so I have a couple of these guys already set up. They have their own custom UVs and everything. So they're taking up a spot. It's this way of handling decals can run in a similar vein to how people handle how they would handle trim sheets. So here is the decal that I'm working with. It's not the most optimized or compact. Texel density wise, it's very off, considering that these guys should not be as big as like this manhole cover or this debris piece of sod. But I just wanted to show this as an example. So this is just like my albedo with the alpha channel applied to it. I have a height map and normal map for them as well. So what we're gonna do now is I'm gonna take the decal shader that we already did, and I'm gonna just duplicate it. There's the decal shader at. Here we go. I'm gonna rename it to our mesh decal. Emmet. Okay. So let's go in here and then let's change some settings for our decal. We have to bring it back to our surface and we have to leave it as a translucent value. But the thing is that we need to keep our normal map as well as roughness and metalness. I know in the decal that I have set up for the test one, we're not going to be using roughness or metallic, but I do have a second texture set that does use that stuff. So we're going to go back in here and we're going to go and to the transparency settings. And I've already talked about a couple of various ones. These run in different ways of blending, similar to how adjusting the values for transparency for the decals. So we're gonna do our translucency volume because this is usually used for like water and stuff as well. So this one gives us back our roughness, metalness, and normal values. So I'm gonna go in and create another ORM texture. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to change this kind. Actually, no, I'm gonna swap him out like that. There we go. And then let's plug in everything. ORM. And then let's plug in our parallax. Saving. Okay. Now let's go and create an instance. And this is, I'll just call this test. Um, DC I'm at. I always put DC on anything that I'm gonna relate to decals so that it's easier to know that something's not like a material that just has a simple blend or a texture that's gonna be used for like normal transparency or masking. This will be used specifically for decals. So let's plug this back in, turn on some of these guys, and then let's go find our textures and plug them in. Albedo, height, and normal. Show all of them, which they look good. They just need to have some more adjustments on it. So let's start to plug these guys in. So let's select the material, and then I'm just gonna go and drag and drop them. Which they look good as is. You don't have to go in and turn on parallax occlusion in a lot of cases. Like a lot of these guys, they're gonna be used for smaller details. Like naturally, you don't just like leave these like on the floor. These would be used like if you have a material or an asset that's um essentially it has a like it needs to have a lot of surface detail on an overall mesh. Like say maybe this is like a type of machinery thing that has bolts and nuts and all that stuff. And then it has great textile density for everything except for like the smallest details like bolts and nuts. They naturally, if depending on if it's like a 1024 texture or something like that, the details won't show up as sharp. But you want to have those little tiny things pop. You know, if in most cases when you're working like in games, it's great to have like some great small details to pop up and really show like, wow, that actually looks great. But because of your textile density naturally is the application of texture size in relations to world size. So, say you're creating an asset that's 1 meter. Most studios designate like what type of resolution equals a type of measurement. So, our studio uses 256 pixels per meter. So, a 256 by 256 texture is supposed to cover at least 1 meter's size of an object, and then 512 for 2 meters, 2048 for 4 meters. I should know. Am I doing no 3 meters and then I think I'm no, yeah, I'm blanking. It's you double it every time. So one time, then two times, then four, then eight, and so on and so forth. Um, in some other cases with the studios, um, when you use like all your UVs and your channel packing everything and everything fits, and then like say like the nuts and bolts for whatever reason are because you have everything like UV, they just don't pop very well. What some people do is they create a spot somewhere in your UVs where you have like a higher size for like these decals and stuff, and then they'll bake them down on a flat plane, and then they'll place them on something like this where you just go in and you're like, "Man, I just want it to look good." So, you kinda start, in your mesh creator, not here in Unreal Engine. So, you do this, like, in Maya or Max, and you're just trying to, like, planarly place it so that it looks flush and that it feels like, "Oh, man, this looks like it was actually built, like, really well." Like, you see this detail and stuff, and then if you want to, you can go in and make adjustments like, "Oh, parallax occlusion, this, and that." But just generally, even having a normal map on this really looks good. Um, this is just to show you kind of that kind of information. You can also go in and just have it for these types of assets. So for some of the dungeons we created in Asgard's Wrath, a lot of the ways to break up the repetition of our like architecture set pieces, we would create these decals for like broken cracks and other damage and stuff. And we were not allowed to do parallax occlusion because it became so expensive after a certain point. So try and just do this at first, and then if you have the leeway to do it, by all means, just The thing to make sure is you have to play around with certain little details like, um, the you have to play around with, like, plane height so that your asset doesn't look like it's skating around because of, like, the angles and stuff. So, like, I'll set him to, like, point 0.5. That way he looks closer to the surface. But it looks good. I mean, let me turn down my camera speed height. And that's one of the cool things about with the occlusion stuff is because of how your angles are set, it actually kind of creates the occluding effect that you normally would see with a mesh. These guys look good. It just, you tend to run into the issue of because of how the meshes were created, if you're looking beyond the meshes boundary, it's gonna look weird. And that's where you have to do like adjustments like point zero 0.01, like adjusting your height and then like your plane information like that. Same thing with like something like this guy. But then another thing that some people try to do with decals is let me grab this. You can also in this is just for masking assets, like, you could also go in and create other assets that can be used for blending. Um, Another term for, like, mesh decals is, mesh skirts. Let me see if I can pull up that example. So this is by Aparicio. He's a senior artist over at Sony Santa Monica, and if you ever played the God of War game, in some of the mine levels, they have all these like rocks and stuff, and they wanted to try and make it look organic, like everything was kind of been there, already created naturally. But in most cases, you have a bunch of rocks that you've already created from different sets, and then you texture them differently. Can create these custom mesh values that try and finding a simple texture like that is something like this and something like this, and then just having it blend off on the edges. You can place it on here and actually make it transition very well. Um, so all they probably did was they probably had like a smart material inside of like Substance Painter, and they used that Substance Painter value, created this custom mesh, laid it out through on the UVs, and then they just painted out edges where they want it to blend properly, and then they just make some adjustments. But that's kind of like what a mesh skirt is. We did something similar in some areas, like in Marvel Powers United. I did a lot of mesh skirts for like the damaged area when there's a part where you're on the street level and then you have to go inside the sewers. And we wanted to make the debris look like rocks were falling, and then like there's a better transition between the ceiling and broken stuff. We did something like that. Um, but in this case, I already have this. I created some water puddles, which it's really not hard. I just went into Painter with a flat plane, grabbed some noise, and then just masked out some certain areas, and then just pulled out information for like height and normal and roughness, all that stuff. So let me go and let's create another instance for this guy. Here's our mesh decal, and we'll just call him Puddle. Oh, I duplicated. I didn't instance it. I'm done. Let's see. Instance. Puddle. I'm at. Double click. Albedo. Height. Normal. ORM. Textures. Where's the puddle? So there's our albedo, which already has the alpha. Height. Normal. And ORM. There we go. Now let me grab I already grabbed this one plane, so let me grab the material instance for him. Actually, let me just type in puddle. And boom. He's already If you ever need to, again, just another shortcut is always great. Is if you're selecting like a mesh, if you press the end button, that's like right near where the delete button, insert home, and stuff is. It's between your normal keypad and your numpad. If you press end, it snaps the mesh to the ground. You just have to adjust the height just like a little bit though, because that flashing is Z fighting. The camera can't tell very well with this mesh to like the floor mesh. So here we have an actual puddle, and again, because of like how the normal map and stuff is set up, it looks great. Um, Also because of how things are with like the alpha and the resolution, it looks very pixelated here. And all you need to do in most of those cases is just make some adjustments like let's see if we can actually go and see if we can fix that without messing around with the material. Let's go to the puddle. So one way you can handle things is you can actually make adjustments. So like all this is it's because of the blending and resolution for this guy. Because after a certain point, depending on how the size is, it can be pixelated very badly. You can adjust some things like not that one. Where is it at? Not compression. It's where is it? It's in here. Nope, that's not it either. I'm looking for MIP. MIP load. We're getting closer. One of these ways also you can do is you can try filtering. So if you ever played around with sampling inside of like Photoshop, how you handle the bit valuing you can do through here. So like nearest neighbor, what it does is it kind of contrasts and sharpens everything, and you get this very pixelated shape. It's great for graphics, but it's not good for blendable materials. There's bilinear where it just tries to sample 2 bits, and then there's trilinear which does 3-bit blending. Like it's just the transition of how you blend like these guys together, and it helped a little bit, not too much. You can still see the resolution on there. I'm looking for our here it is. Level of detail. Now, if you know how to do level detail in meshes, that's just the transition between like a high poly mesh to a low poly mesh that Unreal Engine can generate or you can create yourself. Um, Textures have something similar like that called MIPS, which I can't remember what it is. MIP stands for, but basically it runs the same way where it adjusts the resolution based off of the distance. So you can actually make some adjustments from here. When it says from texture group, it just means like by default, what's the normal MIPing value first. You can set it inside of textures, or you can set it within certain things within the material. You can adjust qualities settings. You can go and do here for no MIPS or a blurrings on them. I think we're gonna do blur. So let's blur one of the values a little bit. Blur it a little bit. You actually might not be able to do blurring on this one. Let's hit save. Okay, so our best bet to fix this is going back here inside the material and then making an adjustment to our opacity. Cheap contrast. Then let's make an adjustment. So one, we're gonna set this guy. I want to be able to control how strong the opacity is. That way, I like in some cases, depending on how I set the opacity, I can see what's underneath the puddle. Because when you're looking through anything with water, you want to see like the dirt underneath or what have you. So this is what you would want. So let's set that to 1 and then plug him in. And then this value is going to go into our contrast. And then here is going to be our contrast strength. Plug him in there and in there. No, actually not in there. In there, in opacity. Because we don't need to contrast or sharpen the albedo. We need to sharpen the opacity. Okay. So Let's go to our instance material. Let's start plugging in some of these guys. Yeah, the one thing you're gonna notice is, you don't want to set the settings too hard. It's probably also it's more noticeable because there's no texture information on this guy. There's no normal or anything like that. Let's take a look at taking one of these guys and putting it on a plane that's already there. So I snapped it to this guy, and he's already using parallax occlusion. So there might be some need to adjust like the height and stuff. So just try and find like a good simple spot. Like, you can do that where it's slowly starting to come through or like right there. And then we can do some opacity adjustments like this. Let's do zero point 0.5. No, that's two. There we go. So you can see actually like this looks good where you still have your normal information. It's actually overpowering since it's technically still on top. You can overpower the normal map above here just because of it's the first one. And then you can actually make some adjustments to um let's do something with our height. Maybe not that strong, 0.02. Yeah, this is where you want to really make sure that you got the right value set up for them. There we go. Something like that. And it doesn't you don't want it to seem like it's floating. There we go. That looks pretty good. Oh, actually, there's actually like a little parallax problem right there. Okay, let's hit play because you always want to make sure you test out based off of the perspective that you want with your assets. Make sure there's no weird like clipping. There is floating, which that we probably just need to make some adjustments, like the parallax occlusion height for that guy, and then also for this guy. But for here, I mean, it looks pretty good here. We still have a little bit of float. He looks good. These guys look good too. Though these guys look a lot thicker sticking out. He looks fine. And then he also looks fine too, even though he's like would technically be floating a little bit. Yeah, but that's essentially the mesh decals, or also known as like mesh skirts. I know it was a weird mixture of a bit of environment talk because of how this stuff is handled, and then also using a bit of some of the stuff we've already learned when it comes to like decals as well as like parallax occlusion and stuff like that. Um, it's also I just wanted to show you guys some other type of terminology that you might hear about if you're working on shaders. So, you don't have to always use like parallax occlusion or normal deferred decals. There are many different types of ways to create these types of floating geometry values. And in a lot of cases, what people do is if they have the headway to have it in meshes, they will just create custom mesh values where you don't have to worry about opacity. Um, like the current game that we're working on right now, we can only use opacity in certain aspects of it. We can't use opacity on everything, so we have to create like decals like this as floating geometry where there's no it's all cut out in the proper way without needing to worry and use like opacity mask or opacity at all. So yeah, that essentially is decals.